About 15 years ago, I was in San Francisco on business, and I was stuck there for Shabbos. So I didn't know anybody in San Francisco, but I had a distant relative in Palo Alto. Now today, Palo Alto has a very successful kollel, similar to the kollel that we're here with this morning. And in fact, the Roshei Kollel are very good friends of mine, and I'm pretty involved in the Palo Alto community. And that time, I didn't know anybody except for this one couple. And I walk into shul on Friday night, and in those days, the Palo Alto Minyan, as it was called, was in the second floor of an office building. And they had maybe 15 men on a Shabbos. I walk in to the shul, and the rabbi gets up to speak between Kabbalah Shabbos and Marav. And before he starts, he says, I see we have with us the Shabbos Mr. Moishe Bane from New York. Mr. Bane's involved in this, Mr. Bane's involved in that. And the first time I heard him speak, he said the following. And he told over a joke. And then goes on to say his drasha. And I went over to the rabbi afterwards. I said, Rabbi Feldman, I really appreciate it because, you know, everybody's trying to figure out where they fit in Klal Yisrael. Now I know that my jokes, that's what people remember. Everything else they don't remember. I remember one year we were doing a conference in Indianapolis for the OU of rabbis and presidents of synagogues of small communities. And we had wonderful scholars in residence for the Shabbos. We had a posek, and we had a Rosh Yeshiva, and we had a very prestigious Rav. And there were about 50, 60 communities at this Shabbos. And Motzei Shabbos in the hotel, I went into the lobby and I saw that almost everyone who had been there for Shabbos was in the lobby with a pen and paper writing down on their own what they had heard over Shabbos. So I was very curious to see what was valuable, what were they taking with them. And every balabas was writing over the Divrei Torah that they loved, and every rabbi was writing over the jokes that they liked. It was amazing to me. So I want to share with you the story that Rabbi Feldman in Palo Alto told over because it really is relevant to the theme of what I want to speak about a little bit today. I mentioned the story in Palo Alto as well. Over the years, my wife and I have been involved in a lot of dimensions of Jewish community needs, and one of them is college students who are not Orthodox. And very often we would send the college students to different people for Shabbos. And they would experience Shabbos in different ways in different homes. As we know, every family has a different Shabbos Avirah, different Shabbos atmosphere, and you try to figure out over time which student would be most appreciative of the respective Avirah in various families. And there was a fellow, David, and David was a wonderful, wonderful fellow, and we sent him to a particular family for Shabbos. And after Shabbos, I would always call up the college students and ask how they enjoyed Shabbos. Now, I sent David to this particular family for Shabbos, and I forgot to warn him. It just slipped my mind that this particular family would make Kiddush Friday night, but they wouldn't just make Kiddush Friday night. They would make Kiddush over and over again Friday night. And then they would make Kiddush Shabbos morning, and it was the most lebedik and drunken group of people that we ever encountered. And it's wonderful, and it's really beautiful, and the Mizmirish is unbelievable. So Motzei Shabbos, I call up David, and I say to David, how was Shabbos? He goes, oh, Mr. Bane, Shabbos was fantastic, it was unbelievable. So I said, so David, do you understand now more about Shabbos? He said, Mr. Bane, I have to tell you, I still don't understand why you're not allowed to open lights on Shabbos. But at least now I know why you're not allowed to drive on Shabbos. Now, the Jewish calendar, we're told, has holidays throughout the year in our Jewish calendar. And each holiday signifies a very significant dimension, not only of the philosophy of Judaism, but more intrinsically reflects a different dimension of our relationship with God. Meaning, when we have a Yom Kippur in the middle of Tishrei, it's not that that's the time that we do repentance because it's Yom Kippur, but rather in the cycle of our relationship with God, that's the part of the spiritual cycle that's appropriate to doing repentance, to doing tshuva, and that's why Yom Kippur is there. It's inherent in that period of the year, in some spiritual plane. And when it comes to Pesach, and we celebrate a Seder, we celebrate the Yetzias Mitzrayim, it's not that that's why we celebrate freedom there because it's Pesach, but rather Pesach is there in the middle of Nisan because on this spiritual cycle, that's when the accessibility to this dimension of our relationship with God exists. And we say, Mishenichnas Adar Marbin B'Simcha, that in this month of Adar, we just celebrated Purim just a week ago. This month, which continues not only the 2 weeks before Purim, but even the 2 weeks after Purim, is a time of Simcha. It's a time that we relate to God through this dimension of Simcha, whatever Simcha will mean. Now we also have a concept that in the 30 days before Yom Tov, and most prominently the Yom Tov of Pesach, it's a time to begin to focus on Pesach. So we're now in a very, very interesting period, right this day. On one hand, we're part of Adar. We are part of this month of Simcha where we were supposed to be focusing on our relation with God, with this midah, with this dimension, with this characteristic of happiness, whatever Simcha means. And simultaneously, we're approaching Pesach. And we're part of this 30-day build-up to Pesach. And therefore, this is a very special period. And it's a period that we have to capture what this coalition of Purim and Pesach has simultaneously. And therefore, it's appropriate for us to be talking today about the importance of Limud Torah, the importance of studying Torah. Because everybody knows that the main focus on Pesach is not the cleaning, and not the matzah, and not the maror. Those are mitzvahs that we have to do. The Torah commands us to do it. Those are a spectrum that we're trying to put ourselves into. But what's the primary focus of Pesach? Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. To teach your children about Yetzias Mitzrayim. To teach ourselves, if we don't have children, about Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's learning. The main focus of Pesach is learning. So what we have to do right now is figure out, okay, how does this all fit together? How does Purim fit with this? How does Pesach fit with this? What are we supposed to be doing? And what is the message that we should be taking home? Because, some people think, I go outside and I see there needs to be firemen. Thank God they're firemen. I don't have to worry about the fire because they're firemen. And I don't have to worry about the criminals in the street. There's policemen. And there are other people who think, I don't have to worry about learning Torah. There's a kollel. But that's not true. The kollel is there not to take our responsibility of learning Torah off our shoulders. The opposite's true. The kollel is there in order to allow us to play our role in learning Torah. Well, the question is, what does learning Torah mean? What's learning Torah about? Why is it considered so central to Judaism? I understand Shabbos. If you don't keep Shabbos, you're not an Orthodox Jew. You have to be a Shomer Shabbos. If you don't eat kosher, forget about it. Torah learning, let the rabbi learn Torah. But everything we know about Judaism tells us exactly the opposite. That a person who doesn't learn Torah is not into it, is missing the point. If anything, you could argue that all of these other halachas, all of these other customs, everything else in Judaism is merely there to give us the platform to learn Torah. Well, what's learning Torah? What is learning Torah? So learning Torah has many dimensions. For example, the ABCs of Torah learning. How do you know how to keep kosher? How do you know how to keep kashrus? How do you know how to keep Pesach? Because you have to learn Torah. Torah will tell you how you're supposed to do everything else. If you don't learn about all the halachas, you can pretend you're keeping Shabbos, but you may not be keeping Shabbos. It's like, I know, you look at me, you can tell, but, you exercise to stay in good shape. You could sweat like crazy. If you don't do the exercise right, your muscles don't get stronger. You need someone to show you this is how you exercise. You could pretend you're keeping Shabbos. If you don't know how to keep Shabbos, you're really not doing it right. You can try all you want. You have to learn Torah. So let's start, just because I don't want to spend the half hour, 45 minutes without leaving you with something, let's start a little bit with basics on Pesach. I'll just give you a piece of Pesach, a basic piece, so at least you'll walk away with something that you could take with you and maybe say over at your Seder. We start this Seder night, and in many, many homes, what do we do first, before we even make Kiddush, is we recite the Seder, right? We start with what we are about to do. And what is one of the first things that we mention, and one of the first things that we do, is karpas. Karpas, right? We take a vegetable, some people take a potato, some people take a carrot, whatever, and you dip it in your salt water, and you make a bracha, adama, and you eat it. It's the weirdest part of the Seder. And you try to struggle, what's karpas about? Well, let me ask you a question. What does karpas mean? Every other word that we're reciting in this sequence, kadeh, shurchatz, karp, you know what they mean. What's karpas? So let me hand out something. And let's try to learn about karpas. Turn to the second page. Page 2 of the group that you have. There's not enough. I have more papers. There should be enough. Here you go. Does everybody have? Pass it down? Need more, there are more over here. What is karpas? Where does the word come from? Because very often, if we identify the source of a word we're using, we're able to then put it in context and understand the message that the word is conveying. So where does karpas come from? There was a rabbi by the name of Isaac Bernstein. Isaac Bernstein was a rabbi from the United Kingdom who came to America for a period. He was a rabbi in Manhattan for a few years, and it didn't work out too well. He went back to the UK, and he died very, very young. But one of the legacies that he left are Torah tapes on the Parsha, because there was a period of time in London where he couldn't find a job as a rabbi of a shul, but his shiur on the Parsha was so popular that he started running it in a large hall every Thursday night, and people would come and pay £5 to hear his shiur. And there are tapes out there of Isaac Bernstein's shiurim on the Parsha. Now, Isaac Bernstein was an incredibly eloquent speaker. He wasn't a Bal Machadesh. He didn't come up with his own ideas on the Parsha. But it was so beautiful to listen to him, and he had an ear for what was beautiful in Torah, that he was able to put together shiurim. And I encourage you to find these tapes and listen to them, because they are just delightful and insightful and just enjoyable. If you want to get a yeshivish term, like a geschmack in the Parsha, you listen to Isaac Bernstein. So I heard this Dvar Torah about 20 years ago from Isaac Bernstein, and he says it in the name of Rav Shlomo Kluger. He asked the question, karpas, where does the word karpas come from? It's like a weird word. Rav Shlomo Kluger asked this question. Shlomo Kluger was a very famous, brilliant rabbi. And he points out a Gemara, and this is on page 2 of the handout, a Gemara in the Masechtas Pesachim. Masechtas Pesachim is the tractate of the Talmud that addresses the holiday of Pesach. And it's divided into many, many sections. Part of the sections relate to the Seder night, and tells us most of our customs and halachas of Seder are in that parak. There are other parts of Masechtas Pesachim that tells us the rules of chametz and biur chametz, and how to make matzahs, and what the halachas of matzahs are. But a lot of the Masechta also addresses the Korban Pesach. Because as you know, while we had the Beis HaMikdash, and from the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, we would have on the night of Pesach a Korban. And this Korban was distinct from every other Korban. It wasn't a Korban that was taken on the Mizbeach on behalf of everybody and burnt like a Korban Tomid or a Korban Olah. No, the Korban Pesach had a very unique process that every family got together with other families that had to be designated in advance and was shech the Korban Pesach on the afternoon before Pesach, and then they would get together and eat it together. And a lot of our Seder dynamic, this getting together and focusing on the family of Pesach and learning in this context of this unit of a family, derives from the halachas of the Korban Pesach. They're going to cup with some juice or something. Excuse me. So, this part of the Masechta is talking about, thank you very much. Thank you. It reminds me of a story. There was a young rabbi who was trying to get a job in this very, very prestigious shul. I know, I don't think it happened here. And he was so nervous. He was so nervous about speaking. And the older rabbi who's retiring is sitting there. He sees this young guy jittery. And he tells this young rabbi, he goes, "You see that haft of water here at the podium? It's not water. Take a little bit, it'll calm you down, you'll feel better." So the young rabbi goes and takes a little sip, then takes a little more. By the time it's ready for his sermon, he's finished the entire thing. And he gets up and he gives this unbelievable speech, He's out of it. And he sits back down and looks at the older rabbi and says to the older rabbi, so how was I? And the rabbi goes, you were great, but remember one thing. David slew Goliath, knocked the hell out of him. So I assume that's just oranges. Anyway, so this parak of Maseches Pesachim is talking about the process of this Korban Pesach that was being brought by every family on the eve and the night of the Pesach. And this is the last statement that I've highlighted for you at the end of this parak that tells us about this process. And let's read it. It says, the Mishnah had said, Yotza Kas Rishon, and the way it would work is there would be stages, groups, because there was not enough room. They would come one group and then another group and then another group. And the Gemara is telling us what was the final step that the family would do once they've shechted this animal that they're going to be eating that night. They've shechted it, and now they have to take it home and cook it for the Korban Pesach. So the Gemara says as follows. Tana, Kol echad ve'echad, every single individual family, Naisen Pischoi be'oiroi, they would take this carcass and put it back in the skin, Mafshil acharov, and then they would throw it over their shoulder. That's what the Gemara says. It's directing you. This is what way it was done. And you can't tell, is this a commandment that it has to be done this way, or is this merely an observation that this is what happened? So let's look at Rashi. And I've highlighted Rashi, you'll see on the lower left-hand side. Rashi is explaining this custom. And he says, what does it mean that they put it back inside the carcass inside the skin and threw it over their shoulders? Zok Rashi, Derech Seichrim Yishmaelim Huzah. Describe, you know what they would do it? They would do it like these Ishmaeli merchants that would have their goods and they'd have it in a sack, and the way they'd go from store to store, from town to town, is carrying their satchel on their back. That's the Gemara, that's the Rashi. Okay? Says Rav Shlomo Kluger the following. Where does the word karpas come from? We all say do karpas at our Seder. Where's it coming from? So let's turn to the next page. And we talked earlier, and I wanted this to be a theme, the connection that we see there's a Purim Pesach connection that is very important. The next page is the beginning of Megillas Esther. And lo and behold, you're looking for where karpas is? Here it is. Look at the pasuk that I've highlighted, about a third of the way down. We're now describing the Mishnah of Achashverosh, this famous introductory banquet that starts the entire Purim story, and the Megillah is relating to us its grandeur. And what does the pasuk say in Megillah that we read last week? That there was, among the beauties of this banquet, chur karpas utchelas. That there were hangings on the wall of this very beautiful woolen materials as part of the royalty. That's the kind of materials that would be surrounding royalty. Karpas. Okay, so now we know that the word karpas means a high-end woolen garment. So what? What is karpas? Why are we calling karpas in the middle of our Seder? What does that have to do with karpas? What does it have to do with the Seder? What does it have to do with dipping in the salt water? What's this all about? Now let's look at the next page. This is an incredible Dvar Torah. Well, for those of you who do your weekly Parsha, reading the Chumash and Rashi, you would already have figured this out. Where else is there a reference to karpas? So now we're turning to the Parsha of Vayeshev. Vayeshev tells us one of the most enticing, interesting stories in the Chumash, and tells us of the incident of Jacob, Yaakov, and his 12 sons, and the tension that existed between the 11 sons and Yosef, or the 10 sons and Yosef. V'Yisrael, the first pasuk, V'Yisrael, Yaakov and Yisrael, and I'll tell you a very interesting concept in a minute. V'Yisrael ahav es Yosef mikol banov, ki bein zekunim hu lo, ve'oso lo kesones pasam. Yisrael loved Joseph more than his other sons, and he made him a special garment. A special garment. Now, before I go on to the Dvar Torah, I want to take a detour for just a brief moment, just because another interesting concept. People ask the obvious question. You know, you think about it. Think about Jacob's life. Jacob had a fundamental argument with his brother Esav. In fact, that tension between Yaakov and Esav was so historical that we are suffering for that fight today. The tensions that exist in the world between the world of Esav and the world of Yaakov. You would have imagined that Yaakov, if anybody, would have appreciated the importance of making sure all their children get along. And look at what happened. They didn't get along. Now you would think, hey, look, we all know many, many parents who do everything in every parenting handbook you could imagine, and the kids still have issues. But think about it. To go out and in the face of other children favor one child over another, that's not the way to encourage camaraderie among your sons. So isn't it a little bit strange that our father Jacob would be doing this? Would be favoring one son over another son? You know, come on, the ABCs of parenting is you don't do that with your kids. So a friend of mine, I have a friend, Michael Bernstein, who lives in my neighborhood, who's a psychiatrist. He's published 2 svarim on Chumash from a psychiatrist perspective. And he pointed out to me a number of years ago the following nuance in reading the Chumash. Because when you read through these parshias, and you see the reference to Yaakov, and then you see the other name that Yaakov had called Yisrael, when is the word Yisrael used, and when is the word Yaakov used? So the Chumash tells us that Yaakov was the name of Jacob as a private citizen. That's who he was as a private citizen. But Yisrael was the name given to him by God in his role as the patriarch of a nation. That was his political title. He had 2 roles. One was as a family member, a private citizen, and one was as a community leader, as the patriarch of the Jewish people. And Michael Bernstein pointed out to me that every single reference to Yaakov favoring Yosef is always Yisrael favoring Yosef. It was only in his political role that he would evidence favoritism, because he was identifying Yosef as being the leader of the Jewish people. But any time the word Yaakov is used, there is no evidence of any favoritism at all. Just as an aside. But getting back to our Karpas story. V'Yisrael ahaves Yosef mikol bonav ki bein zakuni mulo v'aso lo kesonas pasim. He created this special garment. Now let's look at Rashi. And this is a home run. Zokt Rashi, pasim. What does it mean, pasim, that he created for him this garment? Rashi explains. Loshen kli, right? It's a garment. That's the terminology. Kamo karpas utcheles. Just like the wool that is referenced in Megillas Esther, this high-end woolen garment, that's the quality of this special tunic that Yaakov gave his son Yosef. This was his ksonas pasim, karpas. Rashi has identified this as karpas. Now, think about what happened to that tunic. What happened to that garment later on in the story? Where did it land up? Does anybody remember what happened to that garment?
Brought back to him.
They what? They dipped it in the blood. That when they sold Yosef, and Yosef going down to Egypt is how we all landed up in Egypt. The entire Jewish people landed up enslaved because the brothers fought with each other. They didn't know how to get along with each other. And the symbol of that is taking this garment and dipping it in blood and bringing it back to their father, pretending their brother had died instead of being sold to Egypt. That's karpas. We're taking karpas, this cloth, and dipping it in salt water to remember them dipping karpas in blood. And why are we doing that at the beginning of the Seder? Because for the next hour, 2 hours, 3 hours at our Seder, we're going to be talking about our slavery in Egypt and how God took us out. But when you want to talk about a tragedy, you got to go back and remember, how did I get into that tragedy? How did I get there to begin with? And the answer is, when brothers fight, that's how come we land up in Egypt. Karpas is why we landed up in Egypt. And that's how we have to start our Seder. Because when we want to talk about Limud HaTorah, when we want to talk about teaching our children and teaching each other and teaching ourselves Torah, the first step in engulfing ourselves in Limud Torah is remembering that we're a Klal Yisrael, we have to get along with our brothers. That's the first step. If you don't get that first step, you don't get anywhere else. And that's the first lesson of Limud Torah. Limud Torah is not a private enterprise. It's not an activity that we could do in a vacuum on our own, in our homes privately, and say, this is my private Judaism. No. Torah is based on a camaraderie of Klal Yisrael. And that's why we have yeshivas, and that's why we have chadorim, and that's why we have kollels. Because it's an avenue to get together, and you'll find in community after community throughout the world, a kollel plays this unifying role for Klal Yisrael. As we get together, because we know that if we want to grow in Torah, we want to learn Torah, we have to do it as part of a Jewish people. Karpas, that's how we start our Seder. We have to remember, if we want to go to the next level of learning, the first step is Achdus and Klal Yisrael. And that's why we're here. We're here together, to learn Torah together. So one dimension of Torah learning, a basic dimension of Torah learning, is to know how to be a Jew. It's very, very critical. I remember when I was in yeshiva, we had a Rebbe. I learned in Ner Yisrael in Baltimore. We had a Rebbe who's no longer alive. He was a Gadol b'Torah. His name was Rabbi Kalevsky. He gave a shir that was so popular that when I was in the shir, there was about 95 Bachrim, and almost all of us stayed a second year in the same shir because it was so alluring and so educational. One day he had a group of us at his house, and he says to us, why do we learn Torah? Why do we learn Torah? His life was only Torah. Why do we learn Torah? So one guy said, well, we have to learn Torah in order to keep mitzvahs. Okay, that's very nice. Another person, well, we learn Torah in order to enjoy God. And everyone said their philosophical reason for learning Torah. Wrong. He said, you're wrong. You go, okay, Rebbe, so why do we learn Torah? Because we learn Torah because the Torah commands us to learn Torah. And whatever the Torah commands us to do, we do. No questions asked. That's why we learn Torah. And much of what we do because it's clear. The Torah says, you do this commandment, you do a commandment. Now, we all know that the Torah's commandments are divided into many different categories. One of the demarcations that's very popularly known is that you have chukim and you have mishpatim. You have mitzvahs that are called chukim, and you have mitzvahs that are called mishpatim. What is the distinction between chukim and mishpatim? The attributable distinction is that a mishpat is a rational mitzvah, meaning is a mitzvah that a society might conclude is appropriate even if the Torah wouldn't exist. So for example, thou shalt not kill. Yeah, I could have figured that one out myself, right? Thou shalt not steal. Yeah, I should figure that out myself. Thou shalt not wear linen and wool together. I wouldn't have gotten that one, right? I wouldn't have figured that one out. That's called a chok. Something that we would, it's, my Rebbe, Rav Weinberg, in Ner Yisrael used to say, it's not irrational, it's super rational. It's based on a rationality that the human being on its own mind would not achieve. That's a chok. So when I was growing up, I always understood that a mishpat, we try to struggle with its meaning, but a chok, just accept it. I was reading an essay by Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, Zatzal the Rav, who talks about this distinction between a mishpat and a chok. And the Rav suggests that we may have a bit of a misunderstanding. That of course it's true that a chok is a halacha that we might have not arrived at on our own. But it's a misnomer, a misunderstanding to assume that we shouldn't try to understand it anyway. That every chok, no matter how abstract, no matter how irrational it might appear to us, is signifying something, is a lesson to us. And therefore part of our responsibility is to delve into those halachas that don't appear to us to be obvious and try to get a lesson from it. So when we talk about limud Torah, okay, the Torah says that we have to learn Torah, period. But why? We should still try to struggle with why. So I want to share with you a final Dvar Torah, and this Dvar Torah is it derives from a very interesting place. Many, many years ago, almost 20 years ago, my wife and I were dealing with different families and different situations, and there was one family that had a lot of issues. The mother was a drug addict, and the kids were having very big difficulties. And one day, we were at a bris in the town. It was not where we live, in a different town. And after the bris, we said, let's drop by this house and see what's going on there. And we came to the door, and I knock on the door, and the grandfather of these children answers the door, and I say, well, where's this son? The son at the time was about 14 years old. And he said, he's not here. I had heard he had stopped going to school, so I didn't believe the grandfather. And I was a very big mechutzef in those days, and maybe still am. And I pushed my way into the house, and I looked for the son. I couldn't find him anywhere. I went to all the rooms, couldn't find him. I went to the basement, I couldn't find him there either. And I saw a door. And I opened the door to the basement, going out of the basement, and it opens into a black room, a darkened room. There was no windows. And my eyes adjust, and I see there's a bed in that room, and I see the boy lying on the bed. And the boy obviously was in a very, very deep depression, and was spending his days in a darkened room in the basement. And for the next year or so, we were dealing with the family, with the boy, with a couple of other siblings. They were all teenagers at the time. And lo yaleinu, what happened within that year was the father, who was healthy, died. So now you had these three children whose mother was a drug addict who had moved out of the house, and their father had just died. And the shloshim of this father's passing was on Shushan Purim. And the family wanted to have a shloshim ceremony. And for some reason, I was, a relatively young fellow. They wanted me to be the speaker at the shloshim. I had been working a little bit with the son, and I'm not a rabbi. I'm a guy. When we say the shloshim, three young kids, the father died. What do you say? What do you say at a shloshim of this kind of tragedy? And I'm driving to the shloshim, and I still don't know what I'm going to say. It was Shushan Purim. And I get up at the shloshim, and it was like, I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I've had it a couple of occasions where you say things that are so much beyond your personal capacity. Like HaKadosh Baruch Hu just puts in your mind things to say. And I said the following. I said, it's an interesting phenomenon. The only personality that I could identify in the entire Tanakh, who when that personality is introduced to us, is identified as an orphan, the only one is Esther. When the Megillah tells us who Esther is, one of the first things that we learn is she does not have a mother and she does not have a father. Why do we need to know that? Why is that fundamental to understanding Esther and Esther's role? That was my question. And then I asked another question. Look at your first sheet on the handout that I shared with you. This is a Gemara in Yuma. Yuma is a Masechta that deals with Yom Kippur, but this is a tangent in the middle of Masechta's Yuma. That's a very well-known statement in rabbinical literature, and let's read it together. Amar Rav Asi. Rav Asi said the following: Lama nimshala Esther l'shachar. Why is Queen Esther, or the events of Esther, comparable to the morning, to the rising of the sun in the morning? Why? Apparently there was a famous reference that the miracle of Esther is similar to sunrise. She says, why? Well, what's the connection? Explains Rav Asi the following: Lomer lach, to teach you the following lesson. Ma shachar sof kol halayla. Just like sunrise is the end of the entire night, Af Esther sof kol hanisim. So too the miracle of Queen Esther is the end of all miracles. It's the end of miracles. Now you read this statement, and at least to me, and maybe to you as well, the statement is nonsensical. What would I have said had I written this? I would have said that just like sunset is the end of the daytime, Esther is the end of miracles. To me, that would be a more logical parallel. You have an era of miracles, you see God, right? And suddenly it wanes away. That's like sunset. We're entering a period of darkness. That would have been a more logical parallel to me, but that's not what the Gemara says. The Gemara says that just like sunrise is the end of the night, Esther is the end of miracles. What's the parallel? So I said, well, let's analyze what is the joy of Purim. What was Purim all about? We know we have all these laws, and we read the Megillah, and we have Matanos Levyonim, and we have our Suda, we have Shalach Manos, but what's the underlying philosophical story of Purim? and which may explain why Purim is our introduction to Pesach. What's going on? Why do we have that in this calendar? That it's necessary that we have to prepare 30 days before Pesach. You begin to prepare for Pesach. And when does that 30 days start? On Purim. Purim is the beginning of preparing for Pesach. What's the connection? What's the yesod? The underlying theme of Purim is the following historical phenomena. The Jewish people had a first temple, which they thought was going to be forever. They thought this temple was forever. Now the temple not only was a place to go bring sacrifices, was not only a place to pray, the temple also added an incredible dimension to our Jewish experience. Because in the first temple, there were blatant miracles on a daily basis. There were miracles taking place in the avodah, in the service in the temple, that were so unnatural on a daily basis that God's presence was obvious. The challenge of the Jewish people during that era was not, is there a God, is there not a God, like we have today? No, there was a God. You saw miracles on a daily basis in the temple. And the Jewish people sinned and were no longer worthy, and God allowed the temple to be destroyed. And not only was the temple destroyed, but the Jewish people were sent into exile. And what did they think happened? What was their mindset during that period? They thought, it's not just that the temple was destroyed. And it's not just that we got sent into exile. They thought, it's over. We were the chosen people, and it's over. We're no longer the chosen people. God has wiped his hands of us, and we're on our own. And we're no longer connected to God. We're just like everybody else. That's what they thought. And it was a terrible period in Jewish history. It was a devastating period in Jewish history. Could you imagine the feeling of abandonment, the feeling of forlorn loneliness that the Jewish people were suffering during that period? And what happened in Shushan? What happened in Shushan, through the story that we recited last week in the Megillah, was that they discovered God still cares. God is still there for us. Only now, there's a new era. We don't have what's called Gilui Shechina. We don't have a outward revelation of God on a daily basis. We now have a different type of relationship. It's called Hester Panim. Astir, Astir. That's what Esther comes to the word of the hidden relationship we now have with God. That God still does miracles, but now they're hidden miracles. And that's the era. And that joy. Wow! God is still there for us. That's what Purim is all about. That when we enter into a Pesach, we might think it's over. No, we didn't have a Seder today. And therefore, even though we don't have a Yetzias Mitzrayim like they used to have, we don't have the miracles like they had in Egypt, we have our own miracles. But now they're hidden miracles. But they're still there. They're still there. So I suggest the following. If I am in a darkened room in a basement with no windows, or in the middle of a night that has no stars and moon, and I take a candle and light a match and light the candle, does everybody see the light of that candle? Everybody sees the light of that candle. It's obvious. But if I take that same match and I take that same candle and I go into the middle of a field on a beautiful sunny afternoon with the sun shining brightly, and I light that candle, could anyone see the light of that candle? No one could see it. It's invisible. Is there any less light there during the day than the night? No. Physiologically, the light is exactly the same, but you can't see it. Just like the daybreak, just like the sunrise, is the end of the night. And now when you light that candle, you can't see the light anymore, but it's still there. That's what Esther was. It's the end of miracles, meaning the miracles are still there. You just can't see it as clearly, but it's still there. That's what the Gemara, I suggest, is telling us. I concluded at the Shloshim, I said, and why did Esther need to be identified as an orphan, to be the leader of us in that experience? Because only an orphan knows that even though their mother or father is not there to see, they're still there. An orphan knows their parent always is there for them, whether they're alive and could be seen, or whether they're not alive and are just there in spirit. And it's that midah of an orphan that we needed our leader to have to bring us into this era that we're now involved in, this era of Hester Panim, where we have to appreciate that even though we can't see the miracles, and even though we can't see God on a daily basis, God is there for us. How do we find God? If that's what it's all about, how do we find God? This hike that we have to learn every day, the answer is that's what learning Torah is for. Learning Torah is the avenue for us to find God in this world of Hester Panim. God may have hidden himself, but he left a blueprint. The blueprint is learning Torah. And not just learning Torah to know what the halachas are. Of course, that's critical. But to learn Torah to see, how does God think? What is God's value system? What are the secrets of the universe that every one of us on our level is able to find through learning Torah? And therefore, without learning Torah, all of the rest is fluff. We have to take all of our mitzvahs and all of our Shabbos and all of our kashrus and all of the other mitzvahs and tzedakah that we do, and we have to base it on learning Torah, because that's going to give us our connection to God, and that's what it's all about. Our whole role as a Jew is a journey seeking God. And that's what we're doing on these days, from Purim to Pesach, reinvigorating our commitment to learning Torah, to make sure that the journey not only happens on Purim, not only happens at our Seder, and we don't just learn and teach our children at the Seder table, but that's a springboard for learning every day of the year. I wish you all have a wonderful time building up to Pesach. You should have a Chag Kosher v'Sameach. You should continue to learn with the Kollel throughout the year.
Sure.